Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. We have the vast majority of the team assembled here. So on my screen, I can see in no significant order. There's always a particular order, but that's, one day I'll explain that in a little more detail where that comes from. But I've got Dylan and Robert and Eric Rush, and I've got Chris Capola. I'll let everybody sort of say hi when they pop into the conversation, with the exception of Chris. You have to officially make this Fork in Time episode, so you know what to do.
Hi, good people.
All right, now we can roll. I think this is going to be a fun one. That we've been talking about this for a couple of months, maybe more. Dylan teased the concept here a while back, and it sort of follows on a recent episode here where we talked about some alternatives around the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad. And we have another one that's sort of coming up that's in the queue about some things that are different for at least Maryland during the Civil War. Wherever else that goes, we'll have to see where it's at. So Dylan had been mentioned this one, which I think is a good one, and maybe sort of a connector piece between the two here. So we're not going to go to the U.S. Civil War directly, but we're going to be talking about the U.S. Civil War without a doubt as we go through this episode for a couple of different reasons. We're actually going to go to the major war that preceded that the United States was involved in, and that was the Mexican-American War. So we're going 1846 to 1848. Dylan, I'll let you set us up with the concept here, and then we'll just jump right into it.
You did use major war in quotes, right, when you said that?
Well, it was a significant war for some of us that are in Texas, Robert.
Okay,
no doubt,
okay.
so.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to get into whether this should actually be referred to as a war of northern aggression.
That's the later war, Chris.
No, it's not. No, it is not. To pre-shadow the future episode, Maryland stayed loyal. It's not.
All right.
Chris, you do realize there are places that are further north than Maryland, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Anyway,
but not represented on this podcast.
Very well. My family's from Minnesota, so I don't know if I don't know if that counts. But so anyway, the basic gist for today's fork is we're going to go revisit the Mexican-American War, specifically in the lead up to the Siege of Veracruz, which was the beginning of the campaign that eventually led to the capture of Mexico City. Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers himself, probably the greatest, from a purely military perspective, general of the United States Army between Washington and the Civil War. Jackson, probably more of a politician, which is why I say that, at least in terms of his sort of historical understanding. Winfield Scott is in charge of the Siege of Veracruz and the eventual push towards Mexico City. Zachary Taylor's doing fun stuff up in Texas. We're going to worry about him later. When they're going to scout out the Siege of Veracruz, which is this big naval fort, it's known as the Gibraltar of Mexico. It's this huge, secure fort that they have to try and take. They go to scout it out in March of 1846. And while Scott is on a scouting expedition on a boat going into the harbor, he gets fired upon. The shells miss the boat. The fort, for whatever reason, can't quite manage to hit the boat, and so he kind of skedaddles back out of range and says, "Okay, I think we've got what we need. Let's go just blow the place wide open." The fork is, what if those shells hit the boat? And the reason why this is kind of a big fork, and we'll kind of go into more details later, but not only is Winfield Scott the commander-in-chief, the general-in-chief of the American military force on the boat, you also have several very famous future American and Confederate military leaders. Robert E. Lee is on the boat. Joseph Johnston is on the boat. Everybody's favorite Scooby-Doo zombie movie cartoon villain, Pierre Beauregard, is on the boat, and George Meade. So you have both sides of the Battle of Gettysburg on this boat. So the question is, you have all these famous people on this boat. What happens if you blow it up? And so that's basically the kernel of our fork. So I'll kind of throw it out to see, kind of immediately what people think is going to happen if we blow up this boat as Winfield Scott is about to take Veracruz, and what's going to happen to an America that's already invaded Mexico. Where do we think this is going to go?
So first, for anyone who is thinking about Winfield Scott's importance. His importance is such that the uniforms that are worn today at West Point, the United States Military Academy, are based on Winfield Scott's units during the War of 1812. So that is how big a player he was in the U.S. military at the time. And he was the one that pushed West Point to be what it eventually becomes. And that's why he grabbed all the guys you mentioned, Pierre Gustave Beauregard, Johnston, Robert E. Lee, Meade, and then other names that come up during this, Ulysses S. Grant, Pete Longstreet, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. They're not on that boat, those last three, but they're all part of this invasion force. So these guys, he pushed for all of that group from West Point to be brought along with this thing. So he is very much formative in the U.S. military. So him being taken out alone is a major problem because the other major generals he brought along, William Worth, one who escapes my memory at this moment. I'm actually rereading Gone for Soldiers at this moment by Jeff Shara. So, which when you threw this out, I was like, oh, this is hilarious. Davy Twiggs, who his most famous thing that he did is when Texas decided to cede from the Union, Davy Twiggs, his thing was, oh, Texas is now part of the Confederacy. Here's all the Army stuff in Texas. I'm going to immediately surrender it to Texas. Oh, and by the way, I'd like to be a general in the Confederate Army along with it. So there is, I think the first real question becomes, who takes over? Because there was no clear commander at that point.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to suggest, I'm glad, Robert, you went through sort of all those other names that are related to this that aren't directly on Dylan's I'll call it Dylan's love boat, or the opposite of the love boat here. The thing it's not gonna be making more than another run.
Yeah, can we, by the way, think about what kind of a boat this was? Like, it has to be one of those, like a whaler launcher, right? Like
it was
15-person boat,
small steam, actually single paddle steam wheeler.
Okay.
I actually remember that from my recent reading.
Yeah. Here's what I'm going to suggest so that because we can go there are lots of places to go off this because the names that we've just mentioned, right? And you remove them from the future history that we know in the real timeline. I'm going to suggest we focus a little bit on the short term, what impact this would have had on the Mexican-American War. But the real fun place to go here, obviously, are people that we don't have for later. When we get to the U.S. Civil War, if we get to the same time of U.S. Civil War, because that's a whole other interesting thing that comes out of this. But I think unless you guys have a different thought, let's hit the Mexican-American War part first, and then sort of do the other part later.
That was my question. The first thing you got to resolve is who's taking over this invasion of Veracruz at this moment.
Well, so a quick Google told me that apparently one of the guys who is in charge of the naval side of things is going to be very famous a couple decades from now when he goes to a certain island off of China. So Matthew Perry may actually be, not necessarily land invasions, but from the amphibious side of things, he may be one of the guys who immediately takes over just because he's familiar with all of the logistics of everything. Otherwise, there's no real famous names that jump out. Other than maybe, Grant, who's not even famous at this point.
Yeah,
most of these Civil War guys they're staff officers now. They're
right.
Yeah, they're like a couple of these guys are in the topographical corps, so they become famous later, but they're just map nerds right now.
Don't you ever denigrate map nerds?
Did I trust me? I am a map nerd. I'm just saying.
I think we're all map nerds, but they're a bunch of lieutenants and captains at this point.
Nobody's going to go leading an entire military theater just based off of a topographical map.
Right. Which to your point, Eric, is that's why they're all on the boat, because they're not all senior staff.
Yeah, exactly.
They're staff. Yeah, they're officers that are serving with Scott, and like was said before, the handpicked by him because Scott knew talent, and there's a lot of talent there.
But I think right now
Lee is the highest ranked as a captain. Everyone else in that list is a lieutenant.
You mentioned Worth. You probably have a decent number of 1812 retreads.
Oh, that's all that's
Indian
there.
fighters,
Is 1812 retreads.
but that have been around long enough and that have the rank to take over. Nobody is putting a captain in charge of this.
No, oh no, definitely not.
Well, and the other interesting thing here, because I had to refamiliarize myself a little bit with the timeline. Most of the fighting is done by this point in California. The California part of this thing is basically done, and so one of the questions is does what happens or doesn't happen when you go land? And by the way, this is like the largest amphibious assault undertaken by U.S. forces. Up till that point, and for a time after, you have to get much later into history. Rolling up towards Normandy to have something of the scale of this type of thing. But the California part of this, Fremont's fun out in California, and resolving things out there, the short-lived republic, that's done. So the California part of this war appears to be done, but the Texas-Mexico border part of this thing, and then some of the other things that come in, basically the New Mexico territory and the things that are related to that are still up for grabs when we're at this point here.
So I have a question. So if I remember right, it was actually Zachary Taylor's Army of Occupation that had transferred command to Scott. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about this, because Scott comes up with the idea. Zachary Taylor actually does the execution of, all the adventures in sort of northern Mexico, and then Scott's going to kind of hook down and cut him off more in the middle. So the interesting thing about killing Scott right now is this is his brainchild no matter what. So even if he's not here to execute it, somebody's got a roadmap. It's just a question of who it's going to be.
But the other thing,
could it go back to Taylor?
That's actually what I was going to suggest, just because he's the one who's most naturally, got the structure set.
I don't think so.
Absolutely not.
I'm going to let
Absolutely not.
I'm going to let Robert say his thing, but
there's
a pretty
I'm interested.
deep rivalry between
Bingo. Polk hated Taylor, and Taylor made no bones about he wanted to run for president.
I was actually going to say between Taylor and Scott. They also hated each other. And
too.
Taylor very much thought that I'm doing all the fighting. I'm actually winning battles. And now you're going to come sweep in and take all the glory.
Yeah, but that makes sense. That especially, and I that was something I did not know, that there was animosity between Taylor and Polk, but it makes sense that there would be. And so that would, so they're, we're not immune to politics with this.
I was a little.
I'm going to throw a name out because I found my third name. Land command passes to Robert Patterson, Major General.
Oh,
he did 3 generals.
Because didn't he command a brigade?
Boy. He commanded the quote unquote volunteer brigade.
Yeah.
In this, and Patterson was Polk's guy, basically. He was thrown in, and Polk considered him in command of the overall thing as it went through, because he had actually been there in the north and then went back and jumped on the boat to go down with them. So I think Worth pitches a fit. Twiggs is Twiggs. Twiggs just does stupid stuff because he's Davy Twiggs. But Robert Patterson assumes command of this.
I could see that.
So is there any? Obviously, it's a blow to lose Scott, lose some of the other junior staff that's here, but there's other folks who can step in. I guess my first fundamental question is, because you actually raised this in your notes still, is what is the outcome of this on the actual Mexican-American War? I mean, at the end of the day, it's different people that we know from history, but the outcome is the same. Or is this material enough to change the conduct of what happens in the war from this point forward? Again, in my mind, the California part's already done. This is really what's going to happen more towards the eastern part of all of this and the Texas-related part, and then more towards New Mexico.
So I'm going to throw out there's a potential possibility it fundamentally changes it, because there is one junior staff officer on there who came up with some very, very good plans of battle to help take over 2 of the major battles on the way to Mexico City. and he was just a captain at the moment, is Robert E. Lee. He actually he formulated a lot of the, I'm going to use the word tactical ideas, because they get to one point at a lava field. I think it's Senora Guerrera. So pardon my Spanish pronunciation. And the Mexicans basically had mounted two huge forces on top of two hills. They ended up having to do an end run around through a lava field. Lee with Beauregard with him actually are the two that found that path to go around. And of course, you know, Don, you and I know anytime Santa Anna's involved in something, things can go weird.
Yeah, we were talking about this off podcast. I know Chris and I did an episode or two. I think that Robert, you and Chris did an episode or two. Actually, that was maybe a two-parter. I just described Santa Ana, of course, to those of us that are native Texans and have had our Texas history and particularly our Texas Revolution. And then, you know, so we're familiar with Santa Ana in that, you know, that instance, the Alamo instance, the Battle of San Jacinto instance of Santa Ana. But he's like the cat of cats. He's like the guy with 9 times 9 lives. It's like every time you turn around, here comes Santa Anna back, you know, and sometimes he's on, you know, what you would think of as being the liberal side of what's going on with Mexican politics. And sometimes he's on the conservative side. I can tell you whose side he's always on: Santa Anna's side at the end of the day. And yeah, it's interesting here because he's in exile in Cuba and convinces the United States to let him get back into the country through the blockade that the U.S. is implementing, in theory, because he's going to turncoat on the Mexican forces and sell. Before, remember, just again, the quick history lesson here is before we go to war, before the United States goes to war, we're a global podcast. Before the United States goes to war, this is over where the border is going to be between the territory that had been Texas and Mexico for the most part. The question is the Nueces River or the Rio Grande. Then there's sort of this false flag thing where they lure the Mexican forces into attacking them on quote unquote U.S. soil, and then that becomes the provocation for everything else. But all of that was after the United States had offered Mexico a sum of money, just sell us this land. And Mexico refused to do it. And then that's, well, okay, you won't sell it to us. You know, Polk's got his manifest destiny idea going on here. We're going to do it anyway. So, by the way, we do eventually buy land from them at half the price later. So the moral of that story is take the money before the war, when you have a chance, before you become the loser of the war. I chased a long rabbit here. But the point being that there were still issues that were important in the eastern, if you will, the eastern theater of this war. So, and you're right. It was Santa Ana is part of that's how we got off that. Santa Ana is part of is commanding forces that are standing against the U.S. invasion here.
So to finish that out, the United States sent Santa Ana through the blockade to Mexico. Almost
with
like
money,
like a Lenin situation.
Yeah,
thinking that he's going to go in and he's going to destabilize the government and will wind up in charge and will then sign a peace with the United States. And he double crosses the United States, goes to Mexico City, takes power, plans following the plan that far, and then he leads forces against the United States siege at Veracruz, and it's fighting all the way back to Mexico City at all of these battles. Is that basically what wound up happening?
He didn't make it to Veracruz, but yes,
Okay.
he was in command. But he was in command the whole way. Matter of fact, at the Battle of Puebla, which was the second battle, a very famous incident occurred. We captured his wooden leg. He had lost a leg at some point, and we captured one of his legs.
Yeah, I think the real question is just going to be, in terms of what happens to the Mexican-American War, is Polk has clearly engineered this whole thing. He wants it to happen no matter what. So the question, I think, is really just going to be, okay, do we keep does the death of Old Fuss and Feathers and his aide de camp, does that spur the American public opinion and political machine on to be more aggressive against the Mexicans? Or
Yes.
do they take a step back, say, hey, let's get what we can get in, get out, quick, done,
But to
deal with the rest later?
To add another question, does the loss of Robert E. Lee create a longer fight. Or let me just say, all
Well,
of that counts.
that's why I'm getting at the
things.
question, because
we
that
still win.
determines.
We still win, no question.
Yeah. It's just a
But
question of do we push
joked
more or
with-
push less?
Yeah, I joked with Don about, you did use the air quotes for major war. It is now a major war. It is not a, I never want to use the word bloodless for war, but in the grand scheme of life, the Mexican-American War was a very bloodless war. I mean, it something on the order of, those of us who are old enough to remember the invasion of Grenada, something on that order, basically. You know, very, very few relative U.S. casualties. We just kind of march in. We do have some difficulties here and there, but we basically, at the end of the day, we own Mexico. If that happens and they take out the general in chief with his entire staff, and then they push back as we start coming in, there's no money going to exchange hands anymore. My feeling is at some point,
There may be money exchanging hands. It's just going the other direction.
yeah, and at some point, Patterson and Twiggs and Worth, the three generals left here in this area, and perhaps even Zachary Taylor at some point, they turn loose the Texas Ranger contingent that was with them. And
well, and so again, it's a how much do we want to annex?
Yes.
And I think the answer is more. I
Yes.
mean, I think the whole Baja question, I think, is not even a question anymore. I think we're gonna annex Baja. I think we're gonna annex a lot of
Coahuila.
Coahuila,
the northern state, most definitely.
Yeah.
Because now we have spilled excessive blood and treasure to get this done.
Yes.
Okay, so if I picked up on the consensus there, your smart money is still on a U.S. victory. Your smarter money in wherever you go and place these bets, because Vegas doesn't exist as we know it, is on more territory being consumed, annexed, brought in. So the questions after the end of this war, which existed in the real timeline that gets us, for example, to the Compromise of 1850 being part of what flows out of this, because what are you going to do with, oh, by the way, shortly after this, there's gold in that their river there in California. So not only were you annexing California for that reason, but another reason, post the war here, but that you have much more territory to be absorbed into the United States than you did just from Texas, which has already been annexed, but now is made a little bit larger, and the territories that we think of as New Mexico and Arizona and up through that territory there, the Gadsden Purchase that comes out of the backside of this to clean up things as well. So, but I think I heard,
and Don, I would say anything that would be, we would consider El Norte is kind of on the table.
Yeah, and that's big.
That's big.
That's big.
A lot of land.
It's a lot of land. Yeah, it's a lot of land, a lot of people. An assimilation of more culturally, because whatever you want to think of there is the Spanish Mexican influence that exists in California, and then there was what existed in Texas before the Texas Revolution and after this. Let's be honest. Texas was a bunch of Anglos that had come into Texas for the most part, through the impresarios and the other things that were there. So yes, there was that culture, and there were those, language and culturally, religiously, for example, that were, for example, the Catholic influence that existed as a result of that. But nothing like there would have been if you seize much more of Mexico proper.
Yeah.
So do we think the border is still the Rio Grande, or do they go into Tamaulipas?
I think it's somewhere south of Rio Grande in my mind at that point. I just don't know how far south.
I'm thinking you take the top five. So obviously Baja, all of Baja.
Yeah.
You get Sonora, you get Chihuahua, you get Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, and Tamaulipas, which that's in today's
Mhm.
map. Those
Yeah.
states, that area, roughly draw a line somewhere, and that whole northern part of Mexico is now United States territory
I think that's
in my
right.
head,
Yeah.
and
So
potentially part of the Yucatan.
Oh, interesting.
That
Yeah,
potentially we've
I
always had designs on the Yucatan at some level.
Well, I
And there
think
had been
potentially.
kind of a right after Texas seceded,
Yep,
there was a Republic of the Yucatan.
correct.
And in some of these northern areas which we just annexed, there was a Republic
yeah, the
of the
Republic of
Rio
the Rio
Grande.
Grande.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So centralized state control of these areas had been challenged, and there had been a bit of a pre-R secession movements in these areas.
Mhm. Well, Santa Anna built his bones by putting down the rebellions there before he
Some of
came
his
to Texas.
bones. Yeah, some of his
Before he came to Texas and destroyed everything, he did that first.
Well, and taking the northern Gulf of Mexico part, Tamaulipas and some of those other northern states, that makes sense if you think about a sort of revenge oriented
Mhm.
United States in the death of Winfield Scott. They're going to get Veracruz as part of this deal just to insult the Mexican, army and the Republic. So I guess we say, they take, what is that, like the northern, 4, 5, 6 states of Mexico, and then do they maybe try and enforce the independence of the Yucatan Republic? Do we think that's
But
in play, or do you think they're just going to straight take territory?
another question: how does British Honduras look on that? British Honduras for American and other, I'm going to go and say for people that are not what's the phrase you use? Map geeks,
Map nerds.
map nerds.
Nerds.
Which we are all map nerds.
Yeah, is Belize, which is right there at the base. It is a British possession. Britain is still involved in kind of. I mean, remember, Polk had one election on 54-40 or fight that he was going to confront Canada over that border. So maybe the British and Honduras are not, British Honduras, the British and Belize are not exactly pleased.
So
about
this sets up some potential antagonism between the U.S. and British territories for later, or you say
I mean,
the British get dragged
or
in?
that they wouldn't be willing us to give us what's now Oregon and Washington.
I mean that I'll open that. I'll throw that out there. Maybe the British
entirely
aren't.
possible. Because later in his life, guess who settles the deal over? Oh my gosh, the name of the island up top
Yeah,
in
San Juan?
Washington,
not Vancouver.
San Juan.
Oh, yeah.
San
Thank
Juan
you.
Islands. Yeah.
Yeah. Guess who settled that whole argument? Old Fuss and Feathers.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Polk had already, on paper, as I remember, settled the Canadian border. But that was not the world's largest undefended border the way it is today. That was not a fully settled issue. I mean, it had been settled, but it was still the British were probably sore about it, and they were probably not exactly pleased about another American territory. So maybe this is kind of a filibuster thing that but before people start thinking the United States Senate, filibusters were American basically mercenaries around this time and more so later that would basically like buy up weapons and ships and sail around the Gulf of Mexico into Central America, stirring stuff up. So maybe this is the Republic of the Yucatan is some sort of friendly American state that is independent and not part of the United States because it's not contiguous. But that way, U.S. aligned.
Yeah.
That way, it's also not really poking too much of the British and Belize.
Well, and the whole place in my mind, I start going here is you've expanded the size of the expansion chessboard. is the one way I have in my mind here, with a lot more squares to potentially occupy, with a lot more pieces, and the way that that's going to play together in such a way that, even coming down to something like, what we know in the real timeline is the 1850 compromise about, okay, we're going to get California in. What does that look like? What does that mean? You know, whatever compromise of 1850 happens as a result of this boat getting hit by a shell and doing something strategic here is different. I don't know what it looks like. We talked about a lot of different ways that this could come together, but you have more in play that either makes it easier because you have more pieces to trade around. That's one way it might play out, but probably makes it more complicated because you've got more pieces to trade around and more things in play, right?
I actually think this makes, to kind of link some of our forks together, I think this makes our Southern Transcontinental Railroad fork that much more likely, because now that route
is the central route more than the southern
it's
route.
Not cut it well, yeah, but it's also not very close to an unstable border.
Yeah, it becomes more north-south oriented just by the natural path of commerce, because you've got everything going through Veracruz and northern Mexico.
Yeah, and then the nature of the economy of whatever this additional area tends to be, that was Mexico and or coming around, is more agrarian in its orientation, and thus ties to the South, ties to the types of things that favor potentially slave labor and the other things that are there in such a way that it changes that dynamic too.
I would say the Yucatan does. I don't think much of northern Mexico does, because there's not a lot of large-scale agriculture there. The other thing I'm thinking about is if it goes down the route of a southern railroad, if it connects over to Guaymas or one of the other ports on the Gulf of Baja, you can have an earlier canal almost. Yeah.
Well, so here's a wrinkle in this whole thing. So Mexico had already abolished slavery by the time that we're talking about. So if we start looking at what the 1850s impact is, there's a very decent argument that these states, provinces, whatever the American Senate and Congress are going to call them, there's a very real chance that these are not additional slave states that are going to be sitting on Texas's border. They're going to be free states.
I think one of the compromises, they will remain territories.
That's where I was about to go, Eric. Yeah.
Well, the second thing I was going to add in is Texas always has been and forever will be land hungry. And you're going to see a huge Texas influence in those territories.
I'm also going to anger a couple of members of the podcast by pointing this little detail out. Actually, Mexico abolished slavery before Texas left, and they didn't listen.
Pretty much.
Yeah, that was going to be the counter to the point that I was bringing up.
On the ground, Texans gonna Texas.
Pretty much.
You could say that they had a beef.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm not even going to touch that one. I'm going to let that one slide, Dylan.
But either way, this is
interesting point. James K. Polk, the president at this point, only president ever elected from the home of barbecue.
We've never had any presidents from Memphis, Chris. I don't know what you're talking about.
we have had one from Kansas City. Well, independents, but
yeah.
Always devolves to a barbecue conversation. Never fails.
At the end, all roads lead to there. So I think we're agreed then we have literally a different landscape, a different map for us map nerds to be thinking about here, wherever it might be. Anywhere that we talk about the actual Mexican-American War and the change of this on the outcome there?
I mean, I think, at least in terms of a boots on the ground impact, other than a sort of territorial, change of hands, the only real question, and this may be a question for if we get further down the timeline, because it may come up later, is, what does this do to the state of Mexico? Because, you start running into considerations of, their whole sort of Maximilian, French Mexican Empire thing in the 1860s, but that may, that just may be playing second fiddle to whatever else we come up with. I think it's more interesting to see sort of what happens in the 1850s and 1860s, just from the absence of some of these generals in terms of the American scene. But I do think Mexico's not out of the picture yet. I just think it is for probably right now. But that's just me.
Yeah. I definitely think when you first suggested this, part of me said, man, we should just go ahead and say the second episode of this is going to be its effect on the Civil War.
Yeah. And that it very well may be. I mean, we could not even touch that and save it for later. I actually think the impact on the direct Civil War is less exciting than we might think, other than just because the problem is with killing all these guys is it affects the timeline in a way that, it's interesting to note all of the battles that they took part of, but if they're not in a timeline, those battles probably don't happen. So,
well,
at least in the way that we
exactly
understand
the same
them.
way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and a good example of that is First Bull Run, right? I mean, is that going to happen the same way without
or Chancellorsville?
Mm-hmm.
Or Chancellorsville? Yeah, or there will be different battles. I mean, I don't think any of us feel like the loss of these these handful of guys is going to change the kind of the overall political structure and the impending powder keg that is the Civil War. I think that is going to happen regardless. But yeah, you're right. The individual battles will be different.
Yeah,
I'm interested in. We'll get to it. I think there is one example where it might affect something.
Oh yeah, there are a couple I think that actually will do some stuff, but
no Anaconda.
That's
what you lose.
The macro,
no Anaconda. That's right.
Uh-huh.
So I don't think it changes the onset of the war. The war is going to happen.
Yeah.
Now the war looks different, no question. I think just the fact that without Scott, there's no blockade. Is
there no blockade? And hear me out. And the reason I say this.
Okay.
The United States Navy, to a large extent, stayed with the nation. You've got all of this investment. You've got a Navy. Whenever you go to war, what are you doing with it? You need to do something with it.
They became a brown water Navy to start for this, mainly during the Civil War. It became a brown water Navy during that time frame.
My argument is you got these like large, format frigates, ships, line, everything else. That's what you do. And I also feel like given, what Sherman did and everything else, Scott may have come up with the plan, but other people implemented it. And I think what's the old image of the old saying about if you lock enough, listen, I'm gonna take a shot at staff officers now. If you lock enough monkeys in a room with typewriters, pretty soon you're gonna get Shakespeare.
Given enough monkeys and given enough time, you need both, right?
Yeah,
but
just looking at a map, it's like very easy to see the Anaconda plan.
Except in this timeline where you have significantly more Confederate coast that's potentially at play.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Anaconda is still, I think, a natural idea, but
no. Look at no, I'm gonna out Matt nerd you here. Look at Veracruz. Look at Matamoros. Look at all of these places. They all feed into the Gulf of Mexico.
Correct.
And you can, and in terms of a blockade,
you bottle up Cuba.
You can just as easily bottle up the entire Gulf as you can any of these individual ports.
Okay.
I mean, there's a natural choke point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that it's the plan. I just think that the fact that you have that extra coastline to deal with is not something that we should discount. Mm-hmm. I do think it would happen irregardless. I do think one thing that's interesting, and I don't know if there's really any meat to this other than just kind of an interesting point to point out, is that the way we understand the start of the Civil War is probably very different, mostly because the guy who decides to fire on Fort Sumter is not around to give that order, because that was Beauregard. who is now blown off the boat. So the inciting incident to the Civil War probably is a different fort. It's probably still a fort somewhere. It's just not Fort Sumter, but
is it? And the reason I'm asking is like,
I mean, is South Carolina
Charleston
though?
is the home of secession.
Correct.
And
but I mean, there are other forts in South Carolina.
Yeah,
true.
Right. But
so it may not be Sumter. I still think
it's very much on in South Carolina or near South Carolina. Like I don't think it's going to be in Texas or anything.
No,
but
no.
I just
let's go back for a minute because because what is the timeline effect on the start of the war? Because the first thing is this was all done, wrapped up, put a bow on it, 1847 at the latest. My bet is this war that we're describing goes 1848, 1849 before it's wrapped up. So does that change the timeline of the compromise of 1850 to be an 1851, 1852 compromise?
Well, again, back to my point, Robert. I think that the squares and the pieces change, because you've added territory to play with here. And one of the things that crosses my mind, sorry to interrupt there. One thing that crosses my mind here is this idea of if you have now, because you've expanded where your base territory is through occupation, these things that you may annex. And I agree with Eric. Some of these things are not going to become states; they're just going to be territories because that's a nice way to move around the situation you're trying to deal with in terms of the balance of, free versus slave states. Is we can control it without having to declare that if we want to, kind of deal. Is to somebody's point earlier about the filibuster. Do we have an eye on a Guatemala at some point? Maybe we want to go a little bit further down, the Central America. In other words, Manifest Destiny, we think of as being a Western expansion kind of thing, but does it pick up a little bit of a Southern component that goes with it at the same time?
So are you saying this is kind of we're not even arguing about Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're fine admitting those as free states, and we'll admit the Yucatan, which economically makes a lot of sense as.
Or does the Wilmot Proviso gain more steam? As the original Wilmot Proviso doesn't quite work because the timing, it's pre-Mexican-American War. But if you have a United States that's more Gulf-oriented, you can see at some point they probably might have come back to that idea of trying to do Cuba as a territory or state in exchange for something else.
I was going to suggest the push from the South is going to be grab Cuba. Because while that northern Mexico territory, it ain't real good for slave labor, plantation type stuff. Cuba sure is really good at that.
Well, and they kick the can a little longer. So you trade. Just think about where. So there's probably no West Virginia if we kick the can a little further down, at least not right away. And so you trade Yucatan for Kansas. You trade.
Why no West Virginia?
If there's not a civil war that starts in 1861.
Okay.
So let's say we're kicking the can down a few more years. Okay. I'm not saying it never happens. I'm just saying it maybe if we can do what we did before and kind of extension of the Missouri Compromise, we were trading free state for slave state. We trade Yucatan for Kansas, we trade Cuba for Nevada. Because Nevada's 1864.
And you start looking at right around this time, this is when you start getting the territory to state transition of like Minnesota and some of the places up there. So if depending on how the dominoes start lining up, you can easily continue the tit for tat at least a few more years because you've got some states that, you can imagine Congress kind of being like, hey, go settle here real quick so we can make this a state just to sort of speed things up to keep the game going, at least for places like Minnesota. Further west becomes problematic.
But I mean, I think things like, Minnesota is pretty obvious. Nebraska is pretty obvious. Kansas, Nevada, places like that, maybe a little less so considering how things have gone. But if you have other possessions that are further south, that may make that again, it's going to happen, but it's just at this point, when do you start running out of states? Yeah. Or when does it start really becoming an issue? And maybe it is into the 1870s. I mean, I think eventually you are still going to run out of states. Or eventually you're going to have areas that are designated to say, okay, well, this is a free state, so we're bringing in Montana as a free state, and we're bringing in Baja as a slave state. Baja says, we don't want to be a slave state.
Yeah.
what happens then?
I mean, I look at I look at northern Mexico. The only territory we talked about that I think comes in as a slave state is Yucatan.
Mhm.
The rest of it is too sparsely populated. It's not agricultural enough that it doesn't make economic sense.
Unless because you've already headed south, you continue to expand, like we talked about the Cuba concept. You go further down,
and then what you're going to run into is the United States. Think about Henry David Thoreau was against this war, but you're going to have the northern states sitting there saying, wait a minute, why are we paying taxes? Why are we paying blood to extend slavery? Because that's what all of these other wars are going to be.
Well, so here's kind of a question to try and think of sort of what then kicks off this whole Civil War thing. So assuming you have a sort of I don't want to use the word neutered, but that's where my brain goes is, in terms of Mexico, you have the French intervention in 1861. The only reason the United States didn't slap back harder on that is because we had the Civil War. So does the French involvement in Mexico then domino into what might end up becoming the Civil War? You don't think
I
so,
don't
Chris?
think you have the French involvement in Mexico.
I don't think you
the
do
French
either.
involvement in Mexico was a reaction.
Was a consequence of the Civil War. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I think the French even dip their toe in that. I think they know that we will.
They know we're occupied.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is me just doing this for a joke, but bear with me. So say we kick the Civil War into the late 1860s, early 1870s. What if the French Republic moves to Mexico when the Paris Commune takes up?
So they set up a government in exile.
Yeah, government in exile in Mexico. Because reasons. That's all I need.
I mean, one would presume that we would be much more friendly to the French Republic. So, would we welcome them? I don't know.
mean, for those of you that are gamers,
Don't even get me
Hearts of
Chris,
Iron.
don't even get me started. I know
right.
where you're going. Yeah.
Algeria just makes that much more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you actually do have a French settler population there.
Yeah.
But and that was kind of a joke, but it does bring up an important point that I kind of want to make. We're so used to the timeline of the American Civil War being this sort of aside from the Confederate kind of overtures to Britain and France for recognition, like this is seen as a purely American kind of fight. But depending on how you move the timeline, you've got the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. You've got French intervention in Mexico. You've got the Crimean War is on the other side of this. You have some other wars that very easily could dovetail into something that becomes much weirder and wonkier than what we think of in our normal timeline. I don't know that any of them would trigger anything in this timeline, but it's interesting to note that there's a sweet spot that we found in real life that wasn't, kind of on either side, depending on where we want to push this.
Interesting. Well, yeah, that is a fun Hearts of Iron 4 mod that you described there.
And I think we have talked about on a number of different episodes and getting there a number of different ways about, either more overt European involvement in the US Civil War and or what that means going back in the other direction, because now you start moving towards, Franco-Prussian and all the other fun end of the 19th century Europe things where the U.S. really is not involved because there's no direct relation in the same ways, alliances or other things that are going on. And I think, the ripples there get hard to understand because the interference patterns of all the ripples are tough to figure out unless you specify a couple of constants for you to work the variables off of. But it's to I think Dylan was just your point. Now we're so accustomed to the timeline in 1861 to 1865, just sort of sliding in there where it slides in there. we're occupied. So what goes on in Mexico is like that's just what's going on. But the U.S. is not involved because the U.S. is a little occupied, as somebody said, at that particular point. But if you change the timing, we've talked about this so many times and other things. When you change the timing changes as much of the change as the material change often is because of the way things that play together.
I'd at least be willing to think about what would happen in Europe if the French never got involved down there. So maybe they have more troops for the Franco-Prussian War. We never get to the point of
the Paris Commune. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and even the thing that crossed my mind there is, there's even a move afoot now to building either a combination of rail or a canal that would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific across Mexico there, west of the Yucatan, where things, there's a they've done stuff there before in terms of like, a rail thing that came across there. And so if you actually, have the point where the U.S. is occupying that becomes U.S. territory down the road, involvement in Panama,
Forget Panama.
the Panama
We got
Canal
something already.
Yeah, all of that, potentially changes and maybe gets accelerated because the French are building this canal over, French are building this canal over in the Suez.
Right? They were doing Nicaragua, as I recall.
Yeah, and that was the other thought, for what happened eventually became Panama. What's the biggest impact on? So let's that part aside. Let's say we somehow still get to the same 1860-ish American Civil War without our lost compatriots here on the boat. I'm just going to go around and I'll start with you, Dylan. It's your topic. Which battle is most impacted by one of these guys not being around?
So it's probably going to be a tie between either Shiloh or Chancellorsville, mostly just because those are where you have some of the losses of some of the real iconic names. Shiloh, obviously, I think that's where Albert Sidney Johnson gets killed and Lee takes over. Obviously, even if you have a battle that happens close to Shiloh, I think there's enough butterfly effects minorly that there's a decent chance that Albert Sidney Johnson is still in command. And Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee is the one who had the idea to sort of split up his army, and that ends up winning the day, but it costs him the loss of his favorite, sub-commander Stonewall Jackson, who is another sort of super prominent figure. I don't know that any of those actually. I take that back. Scratch both of those. The defense of Richmond, I think, is the biggest thing because Joe Johnston is not there. And I think that actually, assuming a normal play-by-play, would end the war quicker. Because if you have Richmond lost because Johnston can't hold it, I think that takes the whole thing in the bag.
And Lee wasn't back. Lee was not in field command. Lee's job at that point was he was advising President Davis.
Yes.
And his advice was they called him Granny Lee or Granny Spade Lee, because all he wanted to do was build a bunch of fortifications around Richmond, which then become important later in the war. Yeah. But he's not there to be advising Jefferson Davis because, to quote Ulysses S. Grant, the greatest military mind for the Union cause was Jefferson Davis.
Yeah.
During the Civil War.
Well, you've got 3 engineers on the Confederate side who are now no longer there, so anything involving engineering is probably going to be your biggest impact. So
I was supposed to say that the Lee that we have here that's on the boat, he's an engineering officer. Why does he want to dig trenches and go to, because that's that's the way he thinks about things. That's why everything looks like it needing a spade to him, because he has spade drill travel. It's the whole why does everything look like a nail? Well, I got a hammer. That's why everything looks like a nail, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yep.
So obviously these are known. The gentlemen that we've talked about here are known from the real timeline because they are significant. We wouldn't be. There's other people on the boat we might not even know about. Is the whole point of this, right? Because they don't become these names that we know, kind of thing, or at least it's sort of in passing. So does anybody else have any other thoughts about the most impactful, Civil War components of this because of missing actors that we lost to?
I think the peninsula is huge here because you mentioned that Lee's not around to take over if Johnston is wounded. Johnston's on this boat as well.
No, different Johnston. Sorry.
Different Johnston.
Yeah, Albert Sidney Johnston is who Lee takes over for as the overall
No, that's
premier
Beauregard
commander.
takes that.
Oh, does yeah,
Beauregard
you're
gets
right.
that
Sorry.
command.
Yeah.
So
this
There's
is
too
the
many
right
Johnstons in this war.
And by the way, those two battles were occurring relatively simultaneously as well.
That's
So
part of the problem for me. Is I get them confused. Yeah, this is the right Johnston.
So, my man, we actually have McClellan actually doing something.
No.
I didn't go that far.
Just like you told me time and time again, Chris, there's no way to avoid certain wars. I don't think there's any scenario ever where George McClellan actually does something.
But maybe this is my chance for Custer to do something.
No, but he actually landed in the peninsula, and at his own pace, he's taking his time. He's beating Johnston. Is he beating whoever else is there? Because we don't have a Lee who's ready to just knock him all the way back to Norfolk. So, that is a very impactful. I think that right there it could change everything.
We haven't even talked about the other interesting thing here with the loss of somebody, because we've been talking here about Winfield Scott in the context of his military service, but he ran for office
multiple times and he lost all the time
because he was a Whig.
The man was like a bad penny.
Yeah, but most notably, I guess 1852 as running.
52,
running
he
as
was
a
the
Whig?
last, I think, Whig presidential candidate. Because he gets beat by Pierce, I want to say. But I mean, he ran in. That was the interesting thing. I almost brought it up when we were talking about the dislike between Polk and Taylor, because Scott and Polk weren't on any better terms because they were direct political opponents because he had just lost the election to him. Does Scott's death hasten the death of the Whig Party, or does it change it? What happens there, do we think? I don't know.
I think the Whigs are dead.
I think they're dead. I think they nominate Daniel Webster in 1852, but they still get beaten.
Yeah.
And they're done.
Yeah.
So does that cause another party, the nature of political parties really working hard to steer clear of current political context in the United States for all kinds of reasons, but we tend to have two active parties in the United States at any one given point because of the nature of our electoral system. A third party will come up and do one of two things. Their issues will be taken over by one of the two existing parties. That's one way that it goes down, or it displaces another party. You have very rarely do you maintain three parties for very long because it doesn't work well in a winner-take-all electoral system to have more than two parties. And so is it possible that, without Scott being who Scott is, in my mind, Scott is a little bit like your, maybe this bad analogy, but it's the analogy that I have in my head. He's a little bit like your Colin Powell-esque kind of character. He's military success. So that translates into something political or doesn't translate into something political, but it gives him a chance that somebody just off the street wouldn't have because they didn't have that background. So in 1852, do you see an earlier rise of Republicans? Do you see something that looks different? A split of what's always been contentious here about the Democrats sort of have their two wings and struggle with what that means.
I think it's interesting that you suggested Daniel Webster.
Yeah,
because Webster's Maine, correct?
Yeah,
he's New
England. He's North
New England. Yeah.
And so is Scott.
But where's Pierce?
Well, so let's back up.
Pierce is a Northerner, but he's sympathetic to
he's pro-South. But so if we have a different timeline where the Mexican-American War continues for even say an extra year and a half,
Taylor
you don't have an incumbent Whig president. Taylor doesn't run in 48. So you could have another Democrat, which means that you could be looking at, if Taylor's not in the White House to eat his 5 pounds of cherries and drink a gallon of milk on the 4th of July, he doesn't die in office.
Or we just have Polk running as an incumbent wartime president.
I was going to say,
I think you could do that. I think that's possible.
Polk's going to run, I think, in 48. I'm more talking about 52 in terms of, because Taylor's not dead, so he's still in the picture.
Oh, 52. Taylor's going to get his shot, and I think this is when Taylor does get it. Especially as the guy who comes in and
he's the last still the biggest war hero name in American military history. So maybe he's the last gasp of the Whigs.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
By the way,
no
last gasp
Miller
of the
Fillmore.
wigs, maybe the episode title. You may have just hit it, Dylan. But
it couldn't be my dad's favorite golf ball marker, which is Millard Fillmore. It's just not going to work as an episode title, so we have to do what we can.
All right. So Fillmore's not. He's not even there. He's
No,
he's
I
out.
think he's out. Yeah,
Okay.
unless we think he comes in as like a vice presidential candidate or maybe in 1856. But
I think
by then the dominoes wobbling too, or the top's wobbling too much for that to really kind of work.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's too interested in Miller.
Although
Fillmore.
Fremont might be an interesting possibility because he would have also been a war hero, but I still don't know that lines up all
I
that
think,
much.
but I think
Remember,
I
even
could see
Fremont-
him running again in 1856. Like I could
Yeah.
still see that happening.
I mean,
Yeah.
Fremont is still involved. He's running as a free soiler, as I remember.
Yeah, unless
So he's
maybe in this
involved.
timeline the Whigs sort of take on more of that free soil bent, but you never know how much that's going to go in.
and I talked about this idea of a continuing desire, to manifest destiny a little more. What are we manifesting and which way are we destining it, kind of thing, could be there. But then if you have a very protracted thing, in other words, this Mexico thing sort of becomes an early different variant of a Vietnam-esque type of thing, where it's just you're in it, you can't get out of it easily, but you're in it, you can't get out of it easily. Does that sour it going in the entire opposite direction of what I suggested earlier, that comes from the victory and the desire to get more because it's cost you more in terms of blood here? Do you get something where there's a little bit of a change in just the mindset of pumping the brakes a little bit on that whole manifest destiny thing, maybe just a bit, because you're muddled down in this conflict still in Mexico?
I don't think any of this morass aspect of it hits the United States in time for us to stop that territorial acquisition. I mean, if you really look at it, Gadsden Purchase is the last continental territorial acquisition the United States makes.
Yep.
Yeah, agreed.
In the sense of that way. I mean, later, obviously, Spanish-American War, you're going to pick up some territory that you deal with a different way, but it still have part of it that you're dealing with, even to this day.
And Alaska and Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam and all of these Pacific Islands. But this is,
this is what makes the United States the United States,
we've
quote
got
unquote,
this,
that you think of.
We've got this head of
us far.
steam, and none of these hesitancies hit us before we smack into the Pacific Ocean and have what we have.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, going at this close to an hour, guys, any major thoughts before we try to bring it to something that looks like landing at the airport? It's an interesting thing to circle around. There's no doubt about that. There's lots to circle with, but
so I'm going to go ahead and throw the idea out to the group. Do we want to do the second part on how this affects the Civil War?
Oh,
Yes.
I think we have to.
So,
yeah, I think it has to go further down the queue, because the queue of things we have to revisit grows every time we visit something. We have to revisit the things because we visit them in the first place.
Man,
I feel like
still
we should
haven't
just
done-
we should just plan on every topic being a two-parter, because it
You're,
always ends up being that
you're
way.
probably right there, Eric. That would be this. If we had a really smart founder for this podcast who thought that through, that's probably what we do. So we'll see if we can make that happen. But I agree, and maybe the way that we do that is we maybe kind of tie that in about the same time that we look at Dylan's other episode that I know we have in the queue here, which is this idea. And I think this actually maybe came out of a listener suggestion, now that I think about it, which was the whole Maryland is not a border state. Maryland chooses a side. And what does that mean? Kind of deal, because that's a related part to this. But this is why I enjoy what we do here, guys. Because again, this is one of those things we didn't definitively lay out a timeline, but it's just like, part of the reason we didn't is you change this one thing and you just, all these variables open up that you didn't think it was being variables before.
But to set up that episode, Civil War basically happens similar way. I mean, are we comfortable saying that? These are a bunch of captains right now, and they don't become important yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it probably at least happens within 5 years, I think, is probably a safe enough bet.
Just so we've got the base of where we're at.
You're still looking at it sometime in mid-1860s starting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you delay it a couple of years. Your leadership obviously shifts all over the place because of this. Even to the point I would argue, do you get a Lincoln elected? Because Lincoln because the war in Mexico was so minor as it was, his opposition to it gets kind of ignored. But if he was opposed to a major war that killed our general, our grand hero,
Spotty Lincoln would be more of an issue, wouldn't it? And
it would be.
Yeah, that was he was derided when he was briefly in Congress.
Yeah.
For talking about where was the spot where American blood was spilled.
From an intellectual perspective, though, I mean, that was on the south of the Rio Grande, right?
Yeah,
because Texan's gonna Texan.
No, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, I don't. I mean, he was derided already.
Where exactly that was,
but I don't. But I don't think anybody. I don't think anybody cares about the spot anymore because the spot that people care about is in Veracruz.
Right.
Yes.
And so I don't think people care about that anymore. And so I think that does make Lincoln less attractive.
Right.
So maybe he'd still win, but.
Here's what I'm going to remind our listeners. You have thoughts on this, I bet, and we have a place for you and go to give us those thoughts. That's part of the reason that we've set up and we have our feedback channels, various types, email, just clicking on the give us feedback link on our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. But where we get, I think some of our most interesting feedback today is actually on our Discord server, where we post normally each episode and specifically have a set of conversations that normally comes from our regular Discord participants about this. So if you have thoughts on this, we want to hear your thoughts on this, and then also we'll look at those, and that will help inform our revisit of this when we get it into the queue in terms of some things that go from there. So if you want to steer what we do in that revisit, you have a chance. That's one of the nice things about coming back to Eric's point. The nice thing about splitting these things up into two parts that are a space apart is we give our listeners a chance to jump in, and they come up with some interesting twists on things. Our sheep suffrage timeline being part of that as a good example that, we definitely incorporated some things we hadn't thought about there from folks who know at least or more. I think know more about it than we do. Certainly at least as much as we do, but more about it because they actually live in the countries that were directly impacted by that. And so that they tend to have a better sense on what's actually happening there. So I'm going to go around one last time. Any closing thoughts before we close this one out, guys?
No, I think we're good.
I think we're good.
We're going to suggest, as we always do, to our listeners that if you happen upon a fork in time, our suggestion is to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.